reappearance of giants after the flood, which has puzzled so many biblical students, theologians, and regular laymen like myself. We see supposedly all of them being destroyed in the flood, yet the flood is over. People start, populating the world again. And like you mentioned earlier in Numbers 13, we see the reappearance of these giants, but not only in Numbers 13. We see Goliath, we see King Og, uh, and I know that there are a few different schools of thought. The same way, like with the sons of God, I know that there are also a few different schools of thought with how these giants reappeared on the planet. I read about these in your book, but can you please assess all of them? It doesn't have to be in great lengths, but can you please assess them for our audience?
Okay, so there's one story that I particularly like, which I reference in the book in some detail. It's a song that was uh, written thousands of years ago now by the Hittites, and it's called the Song of Ullikummi. And this one's particularly interesting um, because of the way that it overlaps with some biblical ideas. And before I tell you which part of the Bible it relates to, I'll explain a little bit of the story. Okay, so we have these divine beings who are in conflict. You've got the uh, traditional pagan narrative of the Most High God who sort of loses interest in running the world, and he has a son, like an up and coming God, under him who wants to overthrow his dad and take over the universe, so to speak. And they're having this conflict, and uh, the creation of a divine being takes place through um, the uh, conflict between these two, where something from heaven meets something from earth, and the result is this enormous giant made of stone who begins to rise from the depths of the sea and achieves this enormous height where his head is up in the clouds. And this stone giant um, is really fearsome and doing all this violence and damage. And the main reason he's considered to be a threat is because he is beginning to release these semi divine creatures, his offspring, into the world, um, on into the realm of mortal existence on the land. And the the struggle continues in trying to defeat this giant and to bring him down. The end of the story is unfortunately missing because that's what happens to ancient tablets and things like that. They tend to get broken and lost. But the impression that we get is that the uh, the god who is the most high in this story uses the weapon that he fashioned uh, the heavens and the earth with to cut him down and destroy him. Now, I think that that story tells us a lot about the Tower of Babel, and that probably wouldn't have been where most people thought this was going. But in the Tower of Babel story, we have this enormous structure which is built to reach the heavens. And it doesn't say that it is, established in the depths of the sea, but then that's a symbolic reference to the source of supernatural evil. Because in the ancient world, that's, when you dug in the ground, you would find water. And the idea was that water has uh, this way of representing uh, supernatural power. So that comes from the deep, the deep place underground, and you also have spirits in the heavenly realm. So the idea of connecting those two through some kind of stone structure is basically what the Tower of Babel story is about. And the great threat in the Song of Ullikummi is the release of these semi divine beings upon the earth, and this is why they needed to defeat the stone giant. And it was interesting that there were 70 divine beings, sons of the uh, Most High, who attempted to defeat him. They couldn't do it. Uh, in the biblical story, it's that whole Tower of Babel narrative that leads to the 70 nations being created, and each of them end up having one of these uh, sons of God appointed over them. The proliferation of the semi-divine beings from Babel is one that gets lost on us biblically because we don't see that expressly in the text. But then when we think about the purpose of the tower, right, it says uh, that they wanted to reach heaven, that they were the builders of the tower were trying to get access to heaven somehow. And it's not like they really thought that they were going to get up so high and they would get to this elevation where God is, where heaven is. Like they've just got to climb up high enough and then they can stand there and look at God. Again, we're talking in sort of um, symbolic terms. So the idea is we've got this thing that's designed to connect the underworld and the earth and the heavens, and we're using this as a conduit to bring divine power to humanity. And that's basically the purpose of the Tower of Babel. So this is how people intended to uh, reconnect with the Nephilim, who, of course, were wiped out in the flood. And they're doing this by means of tapping into that supernatural power because they understood that the bodies of the Nephilim had drowned in the flood, but their spirits remained active. So, how do they engage that power and seek the glorification that they're looking for, right? Because people are always trying to make themselves into their own gods, aren't they? And so the idea was we construct this tower, we perform rituals, we summon these spirits, and we bond them with ourselves to become the new giants. So, this is what's going on at the Tower of Babel and what follows um, in the religion of the Amorites. And so uh, that's one example of where an ancient text from the Hittites helps to illustrate the same story that the Bible is telling from a different point of view. They've obviously got a different agenda in the reason why they're telling the story and all the rest of it, but there is considerable overlap there, which again reminds us that we're dealing with a common core of reality and truth, um, which the Bible presents to us inherently, and through careful study of that, we can see what was going on at the time.
Yeah, thank you for that context. I remember when I was going through your book, you mentioned a few of those different views, and I remember both from your book, but in general, people would have so many different theories how giants continued after the flood. So for some of them, one of the members of Noah's family carried that supposedly messed up DNA in their blood, so through their offspring new giants came to be. Or maybe for someone, giants could have supposedly, maybe they hid underground, or any of these theories, and you refute them all, and for you it makes the most sense that giants after the flood continue through this mysterious figure called Nimrod. So I was just wondering if you can please explain this view.
Yeah, sure. So uh, one view says, okay, well, what about Noah's wife? Maybe she wasn't a good person. Um, or some people will point at Ham, Noah's son, and his wife. Okay, so we have this idea that since Noah was uh, genetically pure, according to this view, then his sons also, uh, they're good guys and they're genetically pure as well, but we don't know about their wives. So there's some suspicion that perhaps uh, one or more of them might have been related uh, genetically to the Nephilim, and that's caused this carryover into the post-flood world when they start having children. And of course, we look at Ham because he is the father of Canaan, from whom the Canaanites will descend, and then you have the Amorites and everything later on uh, coming through that line. So uh, it all sounds good initially, until you start analyzing it logically. Now, uh, Ham's wife, um, or Noah's wife, whether you try to pick one of those or the other, you end up at the same conclusion because Canaan was born from an interaction between Ham and Noah's wife, so his mother, which is very, uh, I guess, well, I don't want to say cryptically, perhaps it's just obscured by the use of cultural idioms in the expression of the story of Genesis 9. The idea that Ham uncovered the nakedness of his father is, I guess, a polite and gentle way of saying that Ham was actually sleeping with Noah's wife. And they don't want to come out and say that in graphic terms. So it's sort of couched in some idiomatic language, which we can understand from its use in the Bible. So um, that's how we get to understand what that actually means. Um, but then when you look uh, at Canaan, um, he's got some interesting background there, but uh, I think where this all really hits the road is when you look at Nimrod and the Babel story. Nimrod actually, uh, he's the grandson of Noah, so Ham's uh, one of Ham's descendants, but doesn't come from Canaan. Um, Now there are other views as well. I'm trying to remember all. I'll tell you what, I wrote this book 3 years ago, and I've been studying nonstop since then, going through all sorts of other things. Now, the other view is angels. Okay, so what if the angels came back a second time? We had a second incursion of uh, the angels, like we had in Genesis 6. Okay, so what prevents that from possibly happening again? That's something I hear quite a lot. Um, Firstly, there's nothing in the Bible that says that it happened again. In fact, when you read Peter's letters in the New Testament, he makes it very clear that it only happened one time. And he's got some very strong language around that, to insist that it happened only once. So I'll read that from First Peter 3. And just pay attention to the language here. It's very specific. You'll hear terms like once or while or in the days of, uh, sometime or at one time. You have these particular uses of phrases that nail this down to one single point in history. Here's Peter 3:18 to 22. For Christ also hath suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is, 8 souls, were saved by water. The like figure whereunto baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is gone into heaven and is on the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers being made subject unto him. And I include that last part because now that angels and authorities and powers are subject to Christ, we're not going to see that happen again. All right, so Peter's very clear that it happened that one time before the flood, and it hasn't happened since. It's not going to happen again. So that's important. Um, but, aside from what Peter says, we just don't have any biblical evidence of a second incursion. I mean, some people want to point to Sodom and Gomorrah and say, oh, well, there you go. You've got people trying to interact with the divine beings who accompanied God at the destruction of Sodom. Um, that's kind of the other way around, isn't it? Because you've got men trying to have these illicit sexual relations with divine beings. Um, that's the opposite of what was going on in Genesis 6. And even if it happened, um, it's not going to work that way. So that view just falls apart on logical grounds. Uh, so yeah, that's another view, and I think there's a bit more to be said. There's a few views that I tackle in the book, um, which I'm just trying to thumb through because I haven't been through this stuff in a while. The other one is bloodlines. So somebody survived and have been carried this bloodline of the giants through history. This is particularly popular with the conspiracy theorists who look at all the global elites, and how they're all really reptilian shapeshifters, and they've got Nephilim DNA and they preserve their bloodlines so far back and all the rest of it. Um, I just want to point out that uh, genealogies and genetics don't really work the way that they'd like to tell you that they work. I mean, you can look at a genealogy. A genealogy is a story. A genealogy is done so that you can tell some story about, say, you might be talking about yourself and your genealogy, and you'll say, well, I come from a long line of people who were like this, and you illustrate your genealogy in this fashion. You sort of say, well, this was my father and his father, and they were related to this person and that person. And the further you go back, um, you're looking for significant people who exhibit certain traits or have certain qualities that you want to connect to your own story, right? And I did that when we started talking um, at the beginning of this show, and I said, um, my grandparents were missionaries. Right now, I could have told you about my other grandparents on my father's side rather than my mother's side, and I could have said, well, we come from soldiers, who fought in World War II. Right, but I didn't say that because it's not relevant, right? Because I'm here on a Christian show and we're talking about biblical stuff. You know, who cares if my family were soldiers, right? But if I say, well, my ancestors were missionaries, well, that gives me some credence, right? That bolsters my story, and it's true. But you see how I can say one thing about myself and it's relevant and it furthers a point that I'm making. I could say something else about another side of my family history that doesn't really serve the purpose, right? This is how genealogy works, right? You want to find people who further the point that you want to make, and you connect them in the genealogy, and you leave out the others that don't support your point. So when you look at people saying things like, "Oh, you can connect this person who, is the CEO of this big company, or, is in the royal family, or, sits in Congress or whatever, you know, they'll find genealogical links back to people who were, perhaps bad guys, or, had some bad connections, and they'll tell that story to make those connections and to make you think of those people in that way, right? And the same thing happens with this obsession with tracing the bloodlines of people back to the Nephilim, right? I mean, it turns out that if you follow anybody's genealogy back 3,000 years, we're all related to everyone, right? And anyone who existed more than 3,000 years ago is related to everybody who's alive today. And that's just mathematics and genetics. That's, you know, it's pretty basic. Of course, people in the Bible period weren't thinking scientifically, okay? But they still have this understanding that everyone can be traced back to anyone if you go back far enough. And that's why the Adam and Eve story works, okay? Because we're talking about people who represent all of humanity, not because we're by necessity able to trace our lineage, generation after generation all the way back, but because it's understood that people who lived that far back were the ancestors of everybody. So again, for storytelling purposes, you can pick these people and you can say, right, they represent all of us, and that's truth. Okay, but again, it's a story told a certain way in order to be able to tell that truth. So yeah, when we come to bloodlines and stuff, there are people who will sort of weave a complicated thread through the Bible and then through history to try and show that there's this idea of biological descent from the Nephilim. Scripture makes it pretty clear that nobody survived that flood except for Noah and his family, and also clear that the descendants of Noah didn't actually produce biological offspring of the Nephilim. So, really, we've got to look for another alternative that explains the existence of post flood giants.